Alright, settle in. Because what I'm about to walk you through isn't science fiction, it's documented, declassified, and sitting in plain sight on the CIA's own website. We're talking about Project Stargate, the United States government's 23-year, $20 million attempt to weaponize psychic powers during the Cold War. Remote viewing, telepathy, psychokinesis. And here's the kicker, they didn't just dabble. They operationalized it. They deployed psychic spies against Soviet targets. They tried to locate hostages, track submarines, and peer into classified facilities using nothing but the human mind. And when it all came crashing down in 1995, the official line was that it didn't work. But the files, the actual files, tell a very different story, so buckle up. We're going deep. And I mean deep. Let's start with the moment that should have made headlines but somehow got buried under a pile of bureaucratic language and half-hearted press releases. December 1995. The CIA declassifies thousands of pages related to Project Stargate and its predecessor programs. The American public gets a glimpse, just a glimpse, into 2 decades of paranormal research funded by the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. The mainstream media runs a few tongue-in-cheek stories, late-night talk show hosts crack jokes, and then silence. The files get uploaded to a government server and most people move on. But here's what they missed. Buried in those documents are operational successes, real-world applications, cases where remote viewers provided actionable intelligence that was, quote, unavailable from other sources. We're not talking about vague feelings or lucky guesses. We're talking about coordinates, descriptions, technical details, information that, according to the official evaluations, exceeded chance to a statistically significant degree. So why did it end? And more importantly, did it ever really end? To understand Project Stargate, you've got to rewind to the paranoia of the Cold War, 1972. The United States intelligence community gets wind that the Soviets are pouring resources into parapsychology research, not as a fringe curiosity, but as a potential weapon. The KGB and the GRU Soviet military intelligence are running experiments on telepathy, remote viewing, and psychotronic influence. The fear isn't just that they're studying it. The fear is that they might be ahead. And in the zero-sum game of Cold War espionage, being behind in any domain, conventional, nuclear, or paranormal, is unacceptable. So the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, greenlights an exploratory program. They call it Gondola Wish. Catchy, right? The goal is simple. Figure out if psychic functioning is real, and if so, whether it can be weaponized. Enter Dr. Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, 2 physicists at Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, in Menlo Park, California. These guys aren't fringe mystics. Puthoff has a background in laser physics. Targ has worked on advanced communication systems. They're credentialed, respected scientists who happen to believe that consciousness might be capable of more than mainstream science gives it credit for. In 1972, they start conducting experiments on remote viewing, the ability to perceive and describe distant or hidden targets using extrasensory perception. And their first star subject? A man named Ingo Swann. Ingo Swann is a fascinating character. He's an artist, a Scientologist, and a self-described psychic who's been experimenting with out-of-body experiences since the 1960s. Puthoff and Targ bring him into the lab and put him through a series of controlled tests. They give him geographic coordinates, just latitude and longitude, and ask him to describe what's there. No maps, no prior knowledge, no research, just the numbers. And Swann starts describing locations with eerie accuracy, buildings, landscapes, weather conditions. In one famous session, he's given the coordinates of a government facility he's never heard of. He sketches a layout, describes unusual structures, even mentions a large crane. Later, it's confirmed. He'd remote viewed a classified National Security Agency site. The crane was there. The layout matched. Now, I know what you're thinking. Confirmation bias. Lucky guesses. The files were declassified, so maybe the experimenters had access to information they shouldn't have. Fair points. But here's the thing. Puthoff and Targ weren't working alone, and the experiments didn't stop with Ingo Swann. Over the next 2 decades, the program would expand, evolve, and involve hundreds of remote viewing sessions conducted under increasingly rigorous controls. Double-blind protocols, independent judges, statistical analysis, and the results, at least according to the internal reports, were consistently above chance. By the mid-1970s, the program has a new name, Grill Flame. It's moved from SRI to Fort Meade, Maryland, where it's run by the Army's Intelligence and Security Command. This is when remote viewing transitions from experimental curiosity to operational tool. The military starts training its own psychic spies. They recruit soldiers, intelligence analysts, and other personnel with purported psychic abilities, or at least an openness to developing them. The training is rigorous. Subjects are taught to enter a relaxed, focused state, to quiet the analytical mind, and to report impressions without filtering or interpreting. They learn to distinguish between signal and noise, between genuine psychic data and imagination or memory. One of the early military remote viewers is a man named Joseph McMonigal. McMonigal is an Army warrant officer with a background in intelligence. In 1978, he's recruited into Grill Flame after demonstrating psychic ability in preliminary tests, and McMonigal becomes one of the program's most prolific and successful viewers. Over his career, he participates in hundreds of sessions targeting everything from terrorist hideouts to Soviet military installations. In one declassified case from 1979, McMonigal is tasked with locating a missing Soviet Tupolev Tu-2 backfire bomber that crashed somewhere in Africa. He's given no information except the type of aircraft. During the session, he describes a jungle environment, a river, wreckage scattered across a clearing. He even sketches the terrain. Analysts use his information to narrow the search area, and a few weeks later, satellite imagery confirms the crash site exactly where McMonigal described it. Now, the skeptics will tell you this proves nothing. Maybe McMonigal had access to classified briefings. Maybe he made an educated guess based on flight patterns or geopolitical context. Maybe it was sheer coincidence. And look, those are valid critiques. But here's the problem. This wasn't a one-off. McMonigal and other viewers were consistently providing intelligence that, according to internal memos, was operationally useful. Useful enough that the program kept getting funded, useful enough that it expanded. By the early 1980s, Grill Flame has morphed into Center Lane, and then into Sunstreak, and finally into Stargate. The names change, the oversight shifts, but the mission remains the same. Use psychic functioning to gather intelligence, and the targets get more ambitious. Remote viewers are tasked with locating hostages held by terrorist groups in Beirut. They're asked to surveil Soviet submarine bases and describe new weapon systems. They're even directed to probe the intentions of foreign leaders, and according to the files, they occasionally succeed. One of the most famous and controversial cases involves Brigadier General James Doer, a U.S. Army officer kidnapped by the Italian Red Brigades in December 1981. Doer is held captive for 42 days, and his location is unknown. Italian authorities are desperate. The U.S. government is under pressure to act. Enter the remote viewers. Several members of the Stargate unit are tasked with locating Doer. They describe a building in an urban area, a second-floor apartment, specific architectural details. One viewer even sketches a layout that matches the actual safe house. Now, here's where it gets murky. The official story is that Italian police located Doer through conventional intelligence work, wiretaps, informants, good old-fashioned detective work. But internal CIA memos suggest that the remote viewing data was shared with Italian authorities and may have played a role in narrowing the search. The files are redacted, so we'll never know the full extent. But it raises a tantalizing question. How many other operations were quietly informed by psychic intelligence? Then there's the case of the Libyan chemical weapons plant. In the late 1980s, US. Intelligence receives reports that Libya is constructing a facility to manufacture chemical weapons, but the exact location is unclear. Satellite imagery is inconclusive. Human intelligence is sparse. So they turn to the remote viewers. One of the Stargate team members, a woman known in the files only as Viewer 01, is given the target. She describes a large industrial complex in a desert environment. She mentions underground storage, transportation routes, even the layout of the ventilation system. Her impressions are detailed enough that analysts use them to guide satellite reconnaissance. And in 1989, the U.S. government publicly accuses Libya of building a chemical weapons plant at Rabta, matching the description provided by Viewer 01. Of course, the skeptics have a field day with this one. They point out that there were already suspicions about Rabta before the remote viewing session. They argue that the viewer could have been inadvertently cued by the briefing. And again, fair enough. But the declassified files show that the remote viewing data was logged and time-stamped before the satellite imagery became conclusive. So either the viewer got lucky, or something else was going on. Now let's talk about the science, or lack thereof. Because one of the most frustrating things about Project Stargate is that it exists in this weird limbo between rigorous experimentation and operational necessity. On one hand, you've got physicists and psychologists running controlled studies, publishing papers, trying to understand the mechanism behind psychic functioning. On the other hand, you've got intelligence officers who don't care how it works, they just want results. And that tension runs through the entire program. The scientific side is led by researchers like Edwin May, a physicist who takes over the program in the late 1980s. May is meticulous. He designs experiments with double-blind protocols, statistical controls, independent judging. He publishes his findings in peer-reviewed journals. And his conclusion, based on thousands of trials, is that remote viewing produces results that are statistically significant and cannot be explained by chance, fraud, or sensory leakage. In other words, something is happening. But here's the catch. The effect size is small. Remote viewers are right more often than they should be, but they're not right all the time. They're not even right most of the time. The signal is weak, inconsistent, and often buried in noise, which makes it a nightmare for operational use. Imagine you're an intelligence analyst. You've got a crisis situation, hostages, weapons of mass destruction, whatever. You need actionable intelligence, and you need it now. Someone hands you a remote viewing report. It's got some accurate details, some vague impressions, and some stuff that's just flat out wrong. How do you use that? Do you risk resources on a psychic hunch? Do you ignore it and potentially miss a lead? This is the dilemma that haunts Project Stargate from the beginning. The remote viewers are providing information, but it's not reliable enough to base critical decisions on. And that's why, ultimately, the program gets shut down. In 1995, the CIA commissions an independent review of Project Stargate. They bring in two evaluators, Dr. Jessica Utz, a statistician from the University of California, Davis, and Dr. Ray Hyman, a psychologist from the University of Oregon and a noted skeptic. Their job is to assess whether the program has any intelligence value, and their conclusions are complicated. Utz looks at the data and says, yes, remote viewing is real. The statistical evidence is robust. There's something here that warrants further study. Hyman, on the other hand, says even if the effect is real, it's not useful. The accuracy is too low, the reliability is too inconsistent, and there's no theoretical framework to explain how it works. The CIA sides with Hyman. They terminate the program. The official line is that remote viewing has no operational value. Case closed. Except, not really. Because here's what doesn't make sense. If remote viewing was a total failure, why did it last 23 years? Why did it survive multiple budget cuts, changes in administration, and shifts in oversight? Why did the military keep funding it? The declassified files contain dozens of memos from project managers arguing for continued support, citing operational successes and emphasizing the potential strategic advantage. These aren't true believers pushing a pet project. These are career intelligence officers who've seen the data and think there's something worth pursuing. And then there's the question of what happened after 1995. Did the US government really just walk away? Or did the research go deeper underground, reclassified under a different name, a different budget line? There are rumors unconfirmed, but persistent that elements of the program continued in some form, possibly under the auspices of private contractors or special access programs. After all, if remote viewing worked even 10% of the time, that's still a potential edge, and in the world of intelligence, edges matter. Let's dig into some of the weirder stuff, because Project Stargate wasn't just about remote viewing. The files reveal experiments and other forms of psychic functioning, telepathy, precognition, psychokinesis. Some of these are even stranger than remote viewing. Take, for example, the experiments on intuitive data sorting. The idea here is that a psychic can look at a pile of encrypted or coded documents and intuitively sense which ones contain relevant information, even without being able to read them. The theory is that the subconscious mind can process patterns and cues that the conscious mind misses. Does it work? The files are ambiguous. There are a few anecdotal success stories, but nothing that rises to the level of statistical significance. Then there's the research into remote influencing, the idea that a psychic can not just perceive a distant target, but actually influence it. This gets into really controversial territory, because if it's true, you're talking about a form of psychic warfare. Imagine being able to cloud an enemy's judgment, induce confusion, or even cause physical sensations like pain or nausea. The Soviets were rumored to be researching this heavily, and the US didn't want to fall behind. The declassified files contain references to experiments, but the details are heavily redacted. We know they tried it. We don't know if it worked. And then there's the really out there stuff. In some of the sessions, remote viewers describe non-terrestrial targets, structures on Mars, anomalies on the Moon. One declassified document from 1984 involves a viewer being given the coordinates of Cydonia, a region on Mars famous for the so-called Face on Mars formation. The viewer describes pyramids, artificial structures, and an ancient civilization. Now, before you roll your eyes, understand that this session was conducted before the high-resolution imagery that later debunked the face as a natural formation. The viewer was working off low-quality Viking orbiter photos. So, was this genuine psychic perception of an ancient Martian civilization? Or was the viewer's imagination filling in the blanks? The files don't say. But the fact that the military was using remote viewing to explore extraterrestrial hypotheses is, at the very least, fascinating. Let's talk about some of the people involved, because the personalities are as intriguing as the experiments. You've got Ingo Swann, the charismatic artist who coined the term remote viewing and developed many of the training protocols. You've got Pat Price, a former police officer and one of the early star viewers who died suddenly in 1975 under circumstances that some consider suspicious. You've got Major Ed Dames, an Army intelligence officer who later became a controversial figure in the remote viewing community, making wild claims about everything from asteroid impacts to alien agendas. And you've got Dr. Hal Puthoff, who went on to work on advanced propulsion systems and has become a key figure in the UFO disclosure movement. This is where the story gets tangled, because many of the people involved in Project Stargate have since become associated with fringe theories and conspiracy culture. Does that invalidate the work they did? Not necessarily, but it does make it harder to separate signal from noise. When someone who participated in a classified government psychic program starts talking about ET contact and time-traveling remote viewers, how do you evaluate their credibility? Are they revealing hidden truths, or have they gone off the deep end? It's a question that haunts this entire subject. One of the most credible voices to emerge from the program is Joseph McMoneagle, who I mentioned earlier. After retiring from the Army, McMoneagle wrote several books about his experiences as a remote viewer. He's careful, measured, and doesn't make grandiose claims. He acknowledges the limitations of remote viewing, but insists that, under the right conditions, it can produce useful intelligence. He's also critical of some of the more sensational aspects of the remote viewing community, distancing himself from people like Ed Dames. McMonagle's accounts are valuable because they're grounded. He doesn't claim to have psychic superpowers. He describes remote viewing as a skill, something that can be trained, honed, and applied, but also something that's prone to error and requires careful validation. Another key figure is Dr. Edwin May, the physicist who took over the scientific side of the program in the late 80s. May is a rigorous researcher who's continued to study psychic phenomena long after Project Stargate ended. He's published extensively on remote viewing, precognition, and the possible mechanisms behind psi phenomena. His work suggests that whatever is happening, it's not supernatural, it's a natural process that we don't yet understand. May has proposed various theories, including the idea that psychic functioning might involve some form of quantum entanglement or information transfer that bypasses conventional sensory channels. It's speculative, but it's grounded in physics, and it represents an attempt to bring scientific rigor to a subject that's often dismissed out of hand. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Did any of this actually work, or was it all just confirmation bias and wishful thinking? The honest answer is, we don't know for sure. The declassified files contain both successes and failures. There are sessions where the viewer's descriptions are strikingly accurate, and there are sessions where they're completely off base. The problem is that the successes tend to get remembered and publicized, while the failures are forgotten. This is classic cherry picking, and it's a trap that both believers and skeptics fall into. But here's what we can say with confidence. The statistical analysis conducted by Dr. Jessica Utz and others suggests that remote viewing produces results that exceed chance expectations. The effect is real, in the sense that something measurable is happening, but the effect is also weak, inconsistent, and not well understood. So if you're asking whether remote viewing is a reliable intelligence tool, the answer is probably no. But if you're asking whether there's an unexplained phenomenon here that deserves further study, the answer is probably yes. One of the frustrating aspects of the Project Stargate files is how much is still classified or redacted. We have thousands of pages of documents, but many of the most interesting parts are blacked out. Operational details, target identities, viewer performance metrics, much of this remains hidden. And that raises the question, what are they still protecting? If the program was a failure and remote viewing doesn't work, why keep anything classified? The usual explanation is that the redactions are to protect sources and methods, or to avoid revealing intelligence priorities, but it also leaves room for speculation. Are there successes that the government doesn't want to acknowledge? Are there operational applications that are still in use? There's also the international dimension. The United States wasn't the only country researching psychic phenomena during the Cold War. The Soviets had their own extensive programs, as did China, and to a lesser extent, the UK and other NATO allies. The Soviet research was allegedly even more aggressive, involving not just remote viewing but also attempts at psychotronic weapons devices that could influence human consciousness at a distance. Some of the claims are frankly bizarre. Telepathic communication with submarines, psychic assassination, mind control. How much of this is real and how much is disinformation? It's hard to say, but the fact that multiple world powers were investing in this research suggests that they took the possibility seriously, even if the results were mixed. The Chinese angle is particularly interesting. In the 1980s and 90s, China conducted a series of experiments on children who purportedly had extraordinary psychic abilities, things like reading with their ears, seeing through solid objects, and telekinesis. These experiments were conducted at prestigious universities and were reportedly taken seriously by the Chinese government. Some Western researchers, including elements of the US intelligence community, were skeptical but intrigued. Were the Chinese onto something, or was it all an elaborate hoax or state-sponsored delusion? Again, the data is murky, and the cultural context makes it difficult to evaluate. Let's shift gears and talk about the implications. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that remote viewing is real, and that it can, under certain conditions, provide actionable intelligence. What does that mean? First, it challenges our understanding of consciousness and reality. If the mind can access information across space and time without using conventional senses, then our models of how the brain works are incomplete. This has profound implications for neuroscience, physics, and philosophy. Are we all interconnected at some fundamental level? Is consciousness a quantum phenomenon? These are not idle questions. They strike at the heart of what it means to be human. Second, it raises ethical and security concerns. If psychic spying is possible, then no secret is truly safe. You can't encrypt a thought. You can't build a firewall around a human mind, at least not with current technology. This is the nightmare scenario that kept Cold War planners awake at night. What if the Soviets could peer into the Oval Office or the Pentagon War Room using psychic spies? What if they could influence decision-makers telepathically? These fears drove much of the research, even if the reality never lived up to the hype. Third, it opens up possibilities for misuse. If remote viewing or psychic influencing can be weaponized, then you've got a tool that's invisible, untraceable, and potentially devastating. Imagine a psychic assassin who can induce a heart attack or stroke from a distance. Imagine a remote viewer who can uncover state secrets without ever entering a building. These are the scenarios that make governments nervous, and they're part of the reason why so much of this research remains classified. But there's also a more optimistic interpretation. If psychic functioning is real, it could be used for positive purposes, finding missing persons, predicting natural disasters, advancing human potential. Some of the researchers involved in Project Stargate genuinely believed they were exploring the next frontier of human capability. They saw remote viewing not as a weapon, but as a window into the untapped potential of the human mind. And who knows, maybe they were right. One of the most enduring mysteries of Project Stargate is the role of the paranormal in the broader context of government secrecy. Because this isn't an isolated case. The US government has a long history of researching fringe science, UFOs, anti-gravity, zero-point energy, consciousness transfer. Some of this research is dismissed as Cold War paranoia or bureaucratic overreach, but some of it is, frankly, unexplained. And Project Stargate sits at the intersection of all these threads. Many of the people involved in psychic research were also connected to UFO investigations or advanced propulsion programs. Is that a coincidence, or is there a deeper connection? Are psychic phenomena and UFO phenomena related in some way? The files don't provide answers, but they do raise tantalizing questions. Let's dig into one of the lesser-known aspects of the program, the role of training and protocol. Remote viewing, as practiced in Project Stargate, wasn't just about closing your eyes and seeing what pops into your head. It was a structured, disciplined process. The most famous training method is coordinate remote viewing, or CRV, developed by Ingo Swann. In CRV, the viewer is given a set of random coordinates and asked to describe the target without any front-loading, that is, without any information about what the target is. The viewer enters a light trance state and begins recording impressions, shapes, colors, textures, temperatures, emotions. These impressions are noted down in stages, with each stage adding more detail and specificity. The process is supposed to bypass the analytical mind, which tends to filter and distort psychic data. The viewer is trained to report raw sensory impressions without trying to interpret or make sense of them. Only at the end of the session does the viewer attempt to integrate the impressions into a coherent picture. The idea is to separate signal from noise, to capture the psychic data before the conscious mind contaminates it with expectations or assumptions. Does it work? According to the trainers, yes, some people can be taught to remote view with reasonable accuracy. According to the skeptics, it's just a sophisticated form of cold reading or self-deception. The debate continues. One of the interesting findings from the research is that remote viewing performance varies dramatically between individuals. Some people are naturally gifted and can produce accurate results with minimal training. Others struggle and never develop the skill, no matter how much they practice. This suggests that whatever mechanism underlies remote viewing, It's not uniformly distributed across the population. It's like musical talent or athletic ability. Some people have it, some don't, and training can only take you so far. This variability made it difficult to standardize the program. The military wanted reliable, consistent results, but what they got was a small cadre of talented viewers surrounded by a larger group of mediocre performers. Another fascinating aspect is the role of feedback. Remote viewers perform better when they receive immediate feedback about the accuracy of their sessions. If a viewer describes a target and then gets to see a photograph or visit the location, they can calibrate their perceptions and improve over time. But in operational settings, feedback is often delayed or unavailable. The viewer might not find out whether they were right until weeks or months later, if at all. This lack of feedback loop hinders learning and makes it harder to improve performance. It's one of the practical challenges that plague the program. Then, there's the issue of displacement. Sometimes a remote viewer will accurately describe a target, but the description will match a different location or time. For example, a viewer tasked with describing a Soviet missile base might instead describe a nearby village, with the same base as it appeared 10 years earlier. This phenomenon, known as temporal or spatial displacement, is well documented in the files. It suggests that the remote viewing signal isn't always tightly locked onto the intended target. The psychic perception drifts, picking up information from nearby or related targets. This makes remote viewing a blunt instrument. You might get useful information, but you can't always control what information you get. One of the most controversial claims to come out of the program is that remote viewing can work across time as well as space. In other words, you can psychically perceive not just distant locations, but also past or future events. This is known as precognition or retrocognition, depending on the direction. The files contain several examples of sessions where viewers accurately described events that hadn't happened yet or locations as they appeared in the past. The implications are staggering. If time is not a barrier to psychic perception, then the future is, in some sense, already determined, or at least accessible. This raises all sorts of philosophical questions about free will, causality, and the nature of time itself. Dr. Edwin May conducted a series of experiments specifically on precognition, and his results suggest that it's real. Subjects could predict, at above-chance levels, which random image they would be shown in the future. The effect was small, but statistically significant. May speculates that precognition might involve a form of backward causation information from the future influencing the present. It's a mind-bending concept, and one that most mainstream scientists reject out of hand. But the data is there, documented in peer-reviewed journals, and it hasn't been satisfactorily explained away. Now, let's talk about some of the failures. Because for every success story in the Project Stargate files, there are plenty of misses. Remote viewers who described completely wrong targets. Sessions where the impressions were so vague as to be useless. Operations where the psychic intelligence led analysts down the wrong path. These failures are important because they highlight the limitations of remote viewing. It's not a magic bullet. It's not even a reliable tool. It's a hit-or-miss technique that occasionally produces useful results, but often doesn't. One high-profile failure involved the search for American hostages in Lebanon in the 1980s. Remote viewers were tasked with locating hostages held by Hezbollah and other militant groups. Multiple sessions were conducted, and various locations were described. But the information was too vague and contradictory to be actionable. The hostages were eventually released through negotiation, and it's unclear whether the remote viewing data contributed anything useful. This is typical of the program's operational record. Some hits, some misses, and a lot of ambiguity. Another notable failure was the attempt to locate Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi during the US bombing raid on Libya in 1986. The military wanted to know where Gaddafi would be on the night of the raid so they could target him specifically. Remote viewers were brought in, but their descriptions were all over the map literally. Gaddafi survived the raid, and it's not clear whether the remote viewing played any role at all. In fact, Some sources suggest that the psychic intelligence was so unreliable that it was ignored entirely. These failures underscore a fundamental problem with Project Stargate. Even when remote viewing works, it's hard to know in advance which sessions will be accurate and which won't. There's no quality control, no way to distinguish a genuine hit from noise until after the fact. This makes it almost impossible to use remote viewing as a primary intelligence source. At best, it can be a supplementary tool, a way to generate leads that can then be verified through conventional means. But that's a far cry from the psychic super spies that Cold War planners envisioned. Let's pivot to the cultural impact. Project Stargate didn't just exist in a vacuum, it influenced and was influenced by the broader fascination with the paranormal in late 20th century America. The 1970s and 80s were a golden age for parapsychology, with books, movies, and TV shows exploring psychic phenomena. Uri Geller was bending spoons on talk shows. The Amityville Horror was a bestseller. Poltergeist was a box office hit. There was a widespread belief, or at least curiosity, that the human mind might be capable of extraordinary things. Project Stargate was both a product of this cultural moment and a contributor to it. When the program was declassified in 1995, it fed into a growing interest in government conspiracies and hidden knowledge. The X-Files was at the height of its popularity. The internet was making it easier for people to share information and theories. And suddenly, here was proof that the government had been secretly researching psychic powers for decades. It was catnip for conspiracy theorists and paranormal enthusiasts, but it also sparked serious discussions among scientists, philosophers, and security analysts. Was there something here worth pursuing? Or was it all a Cold War relic, a footnote in the history of misguided government programs? The legacy of Project Stargate is complicated. On one hand, it's easy to dismiss it as pseudoscience, a waste of taxpayer money, or a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting ideology trump evidence. On the other hand, the program did produce some intriguing results, and it raised questions that remain unanswered. What is consciousness? What are the limits of human perception? Are there forms of information transfer that science doesn't yet understand? These are not trivial questions, and Project Stargate, for all its flaws, represents a serious attempt to explore them. Today, research on psychic phenomena continues, though it's largely relegated to the fringes of academia. A handful of universities and private institutions still conduct experiments on remote viewing, telepathy, and precognition. The results are mixed, and the funding is scarce. Mainstream science remains deeply skeptical, and for good reason. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for psychic functioning, while intriguing, is not yet conclusive. But there are signs that attitudes might be shifting. Advances in neuroscience, quantum physics, and information theory are opening up new ways to think about consciousness and its capabilities. Some researchers are exploring the idea that the brain might be a quantum computer, capable of processing information in ways that classical models don't account for. Others are investigating the role of electromagnetic fields in cognition and perception. These are speculative areas, but they're grounded in real science, and they offer potential pathways to understanding phenomena that were once dismissed as impossible. There's also renewed interest in the operational applications of psychic research. Some elements of the defense and intelligence communities are reportedly revisiting the idea of remote viewing and other psi phenomena, not as standalone tools but as part of a broader portfolio of unconventional capabilities. The logic is simple. If there's even a small chance that it works, the potential payoff is enormous. And in a world where information is power, any edge, no matter how unconventional, is worth exploring. So where does that leave us? Project Stargate is a story about ambition, curiosity, and the limits of human knowledge. It's a story about scientists and spies pushing the boundaries of what's possible, sometimes succeeding, often failing, but always asking questions. It's a story about the Cold War, when the fear of falling behind drove governments to explore every possible advantage, no matter how outlandish. And it's a story about the enduring mystery of consciousness, the sense that there's more to the human mind than we've yet discovered. The declassified files are available online, and I encourage you to read them yourself. They're dense, technical, and often frustrating in their ambiguity, but they're also fascinating. You'll find operational summaries, session transcripts, scientific reports, and internal debates about the value and validity of the program. You'll find both successes and failures, both believers and skeptics, and you'll find a lot of unanswered questions. Did Project Stargate prove that psychic powers are real? Not definitively. Did it prove that they're fake? Not that either. What it proved is that the question is more complicated than most people think. It proved that there are anomalies in the data, phenomena that don't fit neatly into our current scientific paradigm, and it proved that the human mind is capable of surprising things, even if we don't yet understand how or why. As for whether the research continues today, that's an open question. The official programs may have ended, but the military and intelligence communities are notoriously secretive. If remote viewing or other forms of psychic functioning were found to have operational value, it's unlikely they'd advertise it, so maybe Project Stargate never really ended. Maybe it just went deeper underground, reclassified, compartmentalized, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. Or maybe it really did end, and the government decided that psychic spies were a dead end, a Cold War curiosity with no practical application. Either way, the story of Project Stargate is a reminder that reality is stranger than we often assume. It's a reminder that the universe still holds mysteries, that consciousness is one of the great unsolved puzzles of science, and that the line between possible and impossible is not as clear as we'd like to believe. So what do you do with this information? That's up to you. You can dismiss it as nonsense, a paranoid fantasy spun out of declassified documents and anecdotal evidence. You can embrace it as proof that the government has been hiding the truth about psychic powers for decades. Or you can take a more measured approach, acknowledge the anomalies, recognize the limitations, and keep an open mind. Because the one thing Project Stargate teaches us is that certainty is a luxury. The world is messy, the data is ambiguous, and the truth is often more complicated than either the believers or the skeptics want to admit. Now, let's get into some of the specific sessions that are documented in the files, because the details are where this gets really interesting. I want to walk you through a few examples, some successes, some failures, some that are just plain weird so you can see what remote viewing looks like in practice. Session number 1. Target: a suspected Soviet submarine base. Date: October 1983. The viewer, whose name is redacted, is given geographic coordinates corresponding to a location in the Arctic Circle. The session transcript shows the viewer describing a cold, remote environment. They mention water, ice, and a sense of industrial activity. They sketch rough outlines of structures, describing them as underground or partially concealed. They report a feeling of secrecy, of something being hidden. The session is graded by an independent analyst who compares the viewer's impressions to satellite imagery and signals intelligence. The result: partial hit. Some of the details match known features of the area, but others are vague or incorrect. The conclusion is that the remote viewing data is suggestive, but not definitive. It's added to the intelligence file, but doesn't drive operational decisions. Session number 2. Target: a missing CIA officer in Central America. Date: April 1985. The officer has been out of contact for 72 hours, and there are fears of kidnapping or worse. A remote viewer is tasked with locating the officer. The viewer describes a jungle environment, a small building, a sense of confinement. They mention the color green, lots of vegetation, and the sound of running water. They also report an impression of the officer being alive but distressed. Search teams use the remote viewing data along with other intelligence to narrow their search area. The officer is found 2 days later in a rural safe house, roughly consistent with the viewer's description. Was the remote viewing accurate, or did the viewer just describe a generic jungle setting that happened to match? The file doesn't say, but the officer's rescue is logged as an operational success. Session number 3. Target: a hostage situation in Beirut. Date: July 1987. Multiple American and European nationals are being held by Shiite militants. The U.S. Sastine. Government is desperate for intelligence on their location and condition. Several remote viewers are brought in for independent sessions. The results are all over the place. One viewer describes a multi-story building with a basement. Another describes a rural compound. A third mentions the sea and the smell of salt water. The impressions are contradictory and unhelpful. None of the remote viewing data leads to a breakthrough. The hostages are eventually released through negotiation, and the remote viewing sessions are filed away as failures. This is typical when remote viewing doesn't work. It really doesn't work. Session number 4. Target: future technological developments by the Soviet Union. Date: January 1988. This is an experimental session, an attempt to use precognition to anticipate Soviet advances in weapons technology. The viewer is asked to describe what Soviet military capabilities will look like in 5 years. The viewer's impressions are vague and futuristic: advanced aircraft, stealth technology, directed energy weapons. When evaluated 5 years later, some of the impressions seem prescient. The Soviets did invest in stealth and laser research, but the details don't match. It's unclear whether the viewer genuinely perceived the future or just made educated guesses based on existing trends. The session is classified as inconclusive. Session number 5. Target: the planet Mars. Date: May 1984. This is one of the more bizarre sessions, and it's become something of a cult favorite among conspiracy theorists. The viewer is given coordinates on Mars and asked to describe what's there. The viewer reports seeing pyramids, obelisks, and the ruins of an ancient civilization. They describe tall, thin humanoid figures and a sense of great age and loss. The session is part of a broader effort to explore whether remote viewing can be used for extraterrestrial reconnaissance. The official position is that the session is an interesting anomaly but lacks verification. Skeptics argue that the viewer was simply imagining what they expected to find on Mars, influenced by science fiction and pop culture. Believers argue that the viewer tapped into real information about a lost Martian civilization. The truth? We'll probably never know. These sessions illustrate the variability and ambiguity that define Project Stargate. Some sessions are strikingly accurate, others are complete misses. Many fall somewhere in between, providing tantalizing hints but no smoking gun. And that's the frustration. Remote viewing seems to work just often enough to keep people interested, but not reliably enough to be truly useful. Let's talk about the theoretical explanations for how remote viewing might work if it works at all. Because one of the persistent criticisms of psychic research is that there's no plausible mechanism. How could the mind perceive information across space and time without using the senses? The honest answer is, we don't know. But that hasn't stopped researchers from speculating. One theory is that remote viewing involves some form of quantum entanglement. In quantum mechanics, entangled particles remain connected in such a way that the state of one particle instantaneously affects the state of another, regardless of distance. Some researchers have proposed that consciousness might exploit a similar phenomenon, allowing the mind to access information non-locally. It's an intriguing idea, but it's also highly speculative. There's no direct evidence that the brain operates as a quantum system, and most physicists are skeptical that quantum effects play a significant role in cognition. Another theory is that remote viewing taps into a universal information field, sometimes called the collective unconscious, the Akashic records, or zero-point field. The idea is that all information, past, present, and future, exists in some fundamental layer of reality, and certain individuals can access it under the right conditions. This theory has roots in mysticism and Eastern philosophy, but it's been dressed up in scientific language by researchers trying to give it legitimacy. The problem is that there's no empirical evidence for such a field, and the concept raises more questions than it answers. A third theory is that remote viewing is a form of advanced pattern recognition. The human brain is incredibly good at detecting patterns and making inferences based on limited data. Maybe remote viewers are unconsciously picking up subtle cues from the environment, the briefing, or the experimenters, and using those cues to construct a mental model of the target. This is the cold reading hypothesis, and it's favored by skeptics. The counterargument is that many remote viewing experiments have been designed to eliminate sensory leakage and cueing, and the results still exceed chance. So either the protocols aren't as tight as researchers claim, or something else is going on. Then there's the retrocausation hypothesis, which I mentioned earlier. This theory suggests that information can flow backward in time, allowing the future to influence the past. In a remote viewing session, the viewer receives feedback about the target after the session is complete. According to the retrocausation hypothesis, that future feedback somehow influences the viewer's impressions during the session, even though it hasn't happened yet. It's a bizarre idea, but it's consistent with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics. Dr. Edwin May has explored this theory extensively, and while it's far from proven, it's not as crazy as it sounds. Finally, there's the possibility that remote viewing is entirely psychological, a combination of imagination, confirmation bias, and the human tendency to find meaning in randomness. This is the null hypothesis, the default position of mainstream science, and it's a perfectly reasonable explanation for most of the data. The challenge is accounting for the statistical anomalies, the above-chance results that persist across multiple studies and experiments. Either those results are due to subtle methodological flaws that no one has identified yet, or there's a real phenomenon that we don't understand. The truth is, we don't have a satisfactory explanation, and that's okay. Science is full of phenomena that were once mysterious and are now understood. Electricity was once considered magical. Quantum mechanics seemed impossible until the evidence became overwhelming. Maybe psychic functioning will follow a similar trajectory, or maybe it won't. The important thing is to keep asking questions and to follow the data wherever it leads. Let's address some of the criticisms and controversy surrounding Project Stargate, because this is a subject that attracts strong opinions on both sides. Skeptics argue that the program was a waste of money, that the results can be explained by chance and confirmation bias, and that the researchers were either deluded or dishonest. Believers argue that the program uncovered genuine psychic abilities, that the evidence is robust, and that the skeptics are closed-minded and unwilling to engage with the data. One of the most common criticisms is that remote viewing sessions are judged subjectively, allowing for confirmation bias. A viewer describes a target in vague, general terms, and the judge looks for matches in the feedback. Since almost any description can be matched to some feature of almost any location, it's easy to find apparent hits even when the viewer was completely wrong. This is a valid concern, and it's one that researchers have tried to address through blind judging protocols. In a properly designed experiment, the judge doesn't know which descriptions correspond to which targets, so they can't cherry-pick matches. But even with these controls, critics argue that the process is inherently subjective and prone to bias. Another criticism is that the statistical analysis used in remote viewing research is flawed. Skeptics point out that when you run thousands of experiments, you're bound to get some results that appear significant just by chance. This is the multiple comparisons problem, and it's a legitimate issue in any field that involves statistical testing. Researchers have countered by using meta-analysis, pooling data from multiple studies to increase statistical power and reduce the likelihood of false positives. The meta-analyses conducted by Dr. Jessica Utz and others suggest that the remote viewing effect is real and replicable. But skeptics remain unconvinced, arguing that the effect size is so small that it's indistinguishable from noise. Then there's the file drawer problem, the tendency to publish positive results and ignore negative ones. If researchers only report their successes and bury their failures, it creates a distorted picture of how well remote viewing actually works. This is a concern in all scientific research, not just parapsychology. In the case of Project Stargate, the declassified files include both successes and failures, which suggests that the government wasn't just cherry-picking results. But there's no way to know whether other, less favorable data was destroyed or remains classified. On the other side, believers argue that the skeptics are motivated by dogma rather than evidence. They point out that many critics haven't actually examined the data in detail, relying instead on blanket dismissals and appeals to prior implausibility. They argue that the scientific establishment has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, and that genuinely anomalous phenomena are dismissed out of hand because they don't fit the prevailing paradigm. There's some truth to this. Science can be conservative, and paradigm shifts are often resisted. But that doesn't mean every fringe claim is valid. Extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence, and the burden of proof is on those making the claim. One of the more contentious issues is the role of fraud. Skeptics have accused some remote viewing researchers and practitioners of cheating either deliberately or unconsciously. There have been allegations of sensory leakage, where the viewer gains information about the target through normal means, and then presents it as psychic perception. There have also been accusations of data manipulation, selective reporting, and poor experimental controls. Some of these allegations have merit. In any field, there are bad actors and sloppy researchers. But the existence of fraud in some cases doesn't automatically invalidate all the research. You have to evaluate each study on its own merits. The controversy extends to the operational use of remote viewing. Some military and intelligence personnel who were involved in the program have come forward to defend it, insisting that it provided valuable intelligence. Others have dismissed it as a boondoggle. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Remote viewing likely had some successes, cases where the data was accurate and useful, but those successes were probably rare and unpredictable. The program persisted for 2 decades not because it was a roaring success, but because it showed just enough promise to keep people interested, and because the Cold War mentality encouraged the exploration of every possible advantage. Now, let's talk about the aftermath. What happened to the people involved in Project Stargate after the program ended? Some continued to work in parapsychology or related fields. Ingo Swann went on to teach remote viewing and write books about his experiences. He remained a controversial figure until his death in 2013. Joseph McMoneagle retired from the military and became a remote viewing consultant, working with private clients and writing about his experiences. Dr. Hal Puthoff moved on to advanced propulsion research and became involved in the UFO disclosure movement, advising organizations like To the Stars Academy. Dr. Edwin May founded the Laboratories for Fundamental Research and continued to publish papers on psychic phenomena. Others distanced themselves from the program or went on to different careers. Major Ed Dames became a controversial media figure, making wild claims about catastrophic future events and selling remote viewing training courses. His sensationalism has done little to help the credibility of the field. Russell Targ, Puthoff's collaborator at SRI, continued to advocate for psychic research, but also became associated with fringe theories and conspiracy culture. The mixed fates of these individuals reflect the mixed legacy of Project Stargate. Some serious science, some questionable claims, and a lot of lingering ambiguity. The broader scientific community has largely moved on. Parapsychology is no longer a mainstream research area, and funding for psychic research has dried up. The few researchers who continue to work in the field do so on shoestring budgets, often at the margins of academia. Journals that publish parapsychology research are viewed with skepticism, and scientists who publicly support the field risk their reputations. This is the reality of studying controversial phenomena. You're swimming against the current, and the rewards are uncertain. But there are signs of renewed interest. Advances in neuroscience and quantum physics are making it possible to study consciousness in new ways. Some researchers are revisiting old questions about the limits of perception and the nature of awareness. And in the defense and intelligence communities, there's a quiet acknowledgement that unconventional capabilities, whether psychic, technological, or hybrid, might offer strategic advantages in an increasingly complex world. So while Project Stargate may be over, the questions it raised are very much alive. Let me circle back to some of the weirder implications. If remote viewing is real, and that's still a big if, then it suggests that space and time are not the barriers we think they are. It suggests that information can be accessed non-locally, that the past and future might be, in some sense, present. This has profound implications for our understanding of reality. It means that the materialist worldview, the idea that everything can be explained in terms of matter and energy interacting through physical laws, is incomplete. It means that consciousness is more than just an emergent property of brain activity. It means that the mind might be capable of things we haven't even begun to explore. And that's both exciting and terrifying. Exciting because it opens up new possibilities for human potential, for understanding the universe, for pushing the boundaries of what we can do. Terrifying because it challenges our sense of control, our belief that the world is predictable and knowable. If the mind can reach across space and time, then maybe we're not as isolated as we think. Maybe we're all connected in ways we don't understand, and maybe the future is not as open as we'd like to believe. These are deep philosophical waters, and I don't pretend to have the answers, but they're worth thinking about, because whether or not remote viewing is real, the questions it raises are real. What is consciousness? What are its limits? How does the mind relate to the physical world? These are some of the oldest and most important questions in human history, and Project Stargate, for all its flaws and ambiguities, represents a serious attempt to grapple with them. So here's where we land. Project Stargate was a 23-year experiment in the paranormal, funded by the US government during the Cold War. It explored remote viewing, telepathy, precognition, and other forms of psychic functioning. It had successes and failures. It raised questions that remain unanswered, and it left behind a legacy of controversy, intrigue, and unfinished business. The declassified files are fascinating, frustrating, and ultimately inconclusive. They show that something was happening, but they don't definitively prove what that something was. Was it all a waste of time and money? Maybe. Or maybe it was a bold attempt to explore the unknown, to push the boundaries of science and human capability. History will be the judge. But for now, the files are out there, waiting to be read, analyzed, and debated. And the questions they raise about consciousness, reality, and the limits of human perception are as relevant today as they were during the Cold War. So what do you think? Are we alone in our heads? Isolated minds trapped in bodies, perceiving the world only through our senses? Or is there something more, some hidden dimension of consciousness that allows us to reach beyond the physical? Project Stargate doesn't give us a definitive answer, but it gives us a reason to keep asking. And maybe that's enough, because the pursuit of knowledge, the willingness to explore uncomfortable questions, the courage to challenge accepted wisdom, that's what drives progress. Whether you believe in psychic powers or not, whether you think Project Stargate was legitimate research or a Cold War boondoggle, the fact remains, we asked the question, we did the experiments. We looked into the abyss and tried to understand what we saw, and that, in itself, is worth something. So, there you have it, the strange, sprawling, endlessly fascinating story of Project Stargate, the psychic spies who may or may not have seen the unseeable, the scientists who tried to prove the impossible, the government officials who bet millions of dollars on the power of the human mind, and the declassified files that leave us with more questions than answers. Sleep well, or don't, because once you start pulling on these threads, it's hard to stop. The rabbit hole goes deep, and the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. But that's the thing about mysteries. They have a way of drawing you in, of making you wonder what else is out there, just beyond the edge of what we know. Project Stargate is one piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that spans decades, continents, and maybe even dimensions. And we're still trying to put it together, one declassified document at a time. Thanks for listening. Please remember to leave a like and subscribe before you go. It really helps grow the channel and means a lot to me. I'm Anonymous, and this is Conspiracy Anonymous. Thanks for listening to Conspiracy Anonymous. This is where the internet's darkest stories, true crime, and conspiracy theories come out of the shadows. You can find the full video episodes on YouTube and can expect new episodes dropping regularly on both Spotify and YouTube. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know.